"1 life for 100, she whispered. "Worth it." The medic's hands were already slick with her blood. 90 seconds earlier, Staff Sergeant Wren Callahan had been running, full sprint, across open ground, rounds kicking dirt around her boots while 100 soldiers rolled toward a buried bomb they couldn't see. She didn't shout, didn't hesitate, just threw her body flat across the charge. And behind her, a voice cracked open the desert air, an old man's voice, hoarse from 27 years of silence, screaming a name he'd only just learned to say out loud again. Wren. They pulled her out, barely breathing, started the transfusion, ran her blood against the database. And that's when a young lab technician stopped cold, staring at a match that shouldn't have existed. A name from 1991, a soldier buried at Arlington with full military honors. A grave that had always been empty. Because the man screaming her name outside that trauma bay, he was supposed to be dead.
The wind at Fort Benning did not forgive mistakes. 2,000 yards downrange, a steel plate the size of a dinner plate waited in the heat shimmer. Nobody hit it from here. Nobody was supposed to. Staff Sergeant Wren Callahan lay flat behind a rifle, cheek to the stock, breath slowing more. The world narrowed until it was just her and the wind flags and the plate that refused to grow any bigger in the scope, no matter how long she stared at it. She was 27 years old, 5'3" in boots, the kind of small that made men underestimate her exactly once. Her spotter, Corporal Des Okafor, lay beside her with his own scope trained on the target. He didn't say anything. He'd learned not to. Talking to Callahan mid-breath was like talking to a held note. It broke the thing you were trying to build. Wind 9 miles an hour, gusting to 12, mirage bending the air like water. She adjusted, a quarter click, then held. Because her father used to say the wind lies to you twice before it tells the truth. Because he used to say a lot of things back when he still had a voice to say them with. Her finger found the trigger. Not pulled it, found it. There was a difference, and she'd spent 6 years learning what it was. The shot broke clean, half a second of nothing. Then the plate rang like a church bell, and somewhere behind her a row of instructors went quiet in a way that meant something. Confirmed impact, Okafor said, flat, professional. Except his mouth was twitching at the corner like he wanted to grin and knew better than to let it show. 2040, center mass. Wren didn't move yet, didn't sit up, didn't blink, almost. Because there was a rule her father taught her before he taught her to walk in a straight line. You don't celebrate the shot. You confirm it. Then you find the next one. Except there was no next target today. Just silence and heat, and a line of men who'd stopped believing a woman her size could shoot like that. She sat up, wiped sweat from her jaw with the back of her glove. "Anybody else want a turn?" she said. "Or are we done pretending this was a competition?" Nobody answered, which was answer enough. She packed her rifle case with the same care she'd used to load it. Every movement measured, every latch checked twice, because a rifle that wasn't respected became a rifle that failed you, and failure at this range meant something different than it meant anywhere else. It meant somebody didn't come home. Okafor fell into step beside her as they walked back toward the armory, the Georgia heat pressing down like a wet towel over the whole training ground. "You ever gonna tell me why you don't celebrate?" he said. "Just once. I want to see it. The smile, the fist pump, something. Celebrating means you think the last shot was the hard part. Wasn't it?" "No." She didn't look at him. "The hard part's whatever comes after. The shot's just the easy version of the truth." He didn't have an answer for that. Most people didn't when she talked like her father used to talk, in riddles that sounded simple until you tried to live inside them. Because that was the thing nobody understood about growing up the daughter of a ghost. You didn't inherit grief the way people thought you did. Grief was a single wound, sharp and then healing. What Wren carried was different. A question that never scarred over because it never got an answer. A door in the house of her childhood that stayed locked no matter how many times she rattled the handle. Her mother, Marion Callahan, had raised her in a small house outside Abilene with a mantel that held exactly one photograph and one folded flag, and she had never once, not on birthdays, not on the anniversary of the day the telegram arrived, sat Wren down and told her the whole truth. Because there wasn't a whole truth to tell. Just fragments. A convoy hit, no survivors recovered, a closed casket funeral for a body that didn't exist, buried under a headstone in a national cemetery that Wren had visited more times than she could count in her life, counting each grass blade like it might eventually spell out an answer if she stared long enough. She remembered being 9 years old and asking her mother why they never found him. She remembered her mother's hands, always steady, always capable, going still on the kitchen counter, like something inside them had simply stopped working. "Because the desert doesn't give things back," her mother had said. "Not even the government can make it." Wren had believed that for a long time, believed it the way children believe the things their mothers tell them in low, tired voices at the end of a long day. She stopped believing it the year she turned 21, when a box arrived from the Department of the Army containing her father's personnel file, declassified, in part, released because enough years had passed and enough laws had changed that some information no longer needed protecting. Most of the file was exactly what she expected: training records, commendations, a service history that read like the outline of a man too disciplined to ever be fully known by the people who loved him. But 3 pages near the back had been blacked out so completely that only a handful of words survived the redaction. And at the bottom of the file, stapled almost as an afterthought, was a line that had rearranged the entire architecture of Wren Callahan's life in a single sentence. Remains not recovered. Status missing, presumed killed in action. Case remains open pending further review. Case remains open. Not closed, not resolved. Open. Decades open, gathering dust in a filing cabinet somewhere while a woman in Abilene raised a daughter alone and told her the desert didn't give things back because the alternative was worse. The alternative was hope. And hope deferred, long enough, curdled into something that hurt more than grief ever had. Wren had read that line so many times the paper had gone soft at the fold. Case remains open. She'd built her entire adult life around those 3 words. Every qualification, every extra hour on the range, every transfer request that made her commanding officers raise an eyebrow and ask why a woman with her scores wanted the hardest postings instead of the safest ones. Because a case that remained open was a case that could still be closed. And Wren Callahan intended to be the one who closed it. They called her Ghost Girl before she ever deployed, not because she was quiet, because she disappeared into places men twice her size couldn't find a way in. Her instructors wrote things about her that sounded like myths even when they were true. Youngest female to qualify Army sniper school in her class. Longest confirmed kill shot in a training exercise on record at that base. A shooting eye that didn't waver even when the range officer fired a blank round 3 feet from her head to test her nerve. She didn't flinch that day either, because flinching was a thing that happened to people who hadn't already lost the worst thing they were ever going to lose. Her father, Master Sergeant Eli Callahan, had been Delta Force, 1st Special Forces Operational Detachment, the kind of unit that didn't officially exist in most of the places it operated. He deployed to the Gulf in 1991, part of a reconnaissance team, dropped deep behind enemy lines to find and mark mobile missile launchers before they could be used against coalition forces. He never came home. Officially, his convoy was hit. Officially, there were no survivors. Officially, the Army held a funeral with an empty casket and folded a flag into a triangle and handed it to a woman who was 8 months pregnant with a daughter who would never remember her father's face except through photographs. Wren grew up with that flag in a glass case on the mantel. Grew up memorizing a man from stories instead of memory. Grew up asking her mother questions that never quite got answered. Why did they never find him? Why were 3 pages of his mission file blacked out when the family finally got copies 27 years later? Why did her mother's hands shake every time the subject came up? Like there was a name buried under the silence that she wasn't allowed to say out loud. Wren learned to shoot because her father's old training manuals were the only thing of his she had left that wasn't a photograph. She learned ballistics from his notes in the margins, learned patience from a man who wasn't there to teach her except through ink on paper that had survived him. And somewhere in that learning, a decision hardened in her the way steel hardens. Quiet, under pressure, until it couldn't be bent back. She was going to find out what happened to him. Not someday, not eventually. She was going to make it her job. The transfer request took 4 months to clear. 4 months of interviews, 4 months of a battalion commander asking her more than once why a decorated sharpshooter with her pick of postings wanted a rotation to a forward operating base in a province most soldiers spent their whole careers trying to avoid. She gave him the answer that was true without being the whole truth. "I want to go where the work is hardest, sir." He studied her for a long moment, the kind of look that said he didn't believe her and didn't have the authority to make her explain further. "Approved," he said. "God help you." She didn't need God's help. She needed a records room and enough time alone in it. FOB Widow's Reach sat at the edge of a valley in a province that changed hands more times than anyone could count anymore. Dust, the color of old bone. Heat that pressed down like a hand on the back of your neck. A perimeter fence strung with concertina wire that caught the sunset every evening and turned it into something almost beautiful if you didn't think too hard about what the wire was for. Wren arrived on a resupply flight with a duffel bag and a rifle case and a folder she kept in her personal effects that no one else had seen. Des Okafor had orders to Widow's Reach too, attached to her as spotter for the duration of the rotation. A small mercy she hadn't expected and wasn't about to question. Some partnerships on the range were too precise to break up over an ocean. Her platoon sergeant, a broad-shouldered man named Ruiz, who'd done 3 tours and looked like he'd aged 5 years for every one of them, met her on the flight line. "Callahan," he said, reading her name off her uniform like he was double-checking it against a file. "Heard you're good." "I'm adequate," she said. "The paperwork exaggerates." He almost smiled. "Everybody says that. Nobody means it." "I mean it." He looked at her a second longer than the sentence needed, like he was filing something away. "You'll fit in fine," he said. "Just don't go looking for trouble. This valley finds it on its own." She didn't tell him that trouble was exactly what she'd come looking for. He walked her toward the billets, past rows of HESCO barriers stacked 3 high and topped with wire, past a motor pool where mechanics worked shirtless in the heat on vehicles that had seen more combat than most museums. The base smelled like diesel and dust, and something underneath both of those something Wren recognized from every deployment she'd ever done. The smell of men and women trying not to think too hard about how long they had left. "You're not what I expected," Ruiz said, glancing sideways at her. "Records said ghost girl. I was picturing somebody taller." "Everybody is." "Your file's thin," he said. "Thinner than it should be for somebody with your numbers. Like somebody trimmed it." Wren's pulse didn't change. Her face didn't change. Years of practice kept both steady, even as something inside her went very quiet and very alert. "Maybe I just haven't done enough yet to fill it up." "Maybe." He didn't sound convinced. "This your first rotation this far forward?" "Second." "First one that put you in this particular valley, though. Is that a question, Sergeant, or an observation?" He almost smiled again, that same reluctant twitch at the corner of his mouth. "Little of both. Guys around here, we notice when somebody requests a specific posting instead of taking whatever the Army hands them, especially somebody who could have gone anywhere. There's a story in that. Usually." "Usually," she agreed, and offered nothing else. He let it drop. For now. But she understood, walking beside him through a base built out of dust and wire and diesel fumes, that Ruiz was the kind of soldier who filed things away and waited for them to make sense later. She would need to be careful around him. Not because he was a threat, because he was observant, and observant men asked questions, eventually, whether you wanted them to or not. Her quarters were a plywood room the size of a closet, a cot, a locker, a single bare bulb hanging from a wire. She set her rifle case down with the same reverence she'd used at Fort Benning and sat on the edge of the cot for a long moment, just breathing, just letting the reality of the place settle into her chest. 80 kilometers. That was the number she'd memorized from the redacted file, the last confirmed coordinates before her father's convoy went dark in 1991. 80 kilometers from where she was sitting right now. Close enough that if she stood on the guard tower at the base's northern edge and looked hard enough into the haze, she might be looking at the exact stretch of desert that had swallowed him whole. She lay back on the cot and closed her eyes, and for a moment she let herself imagine him young, the way he was in the one photograph she had, dark-haired and squinting into a sun that had set on a war before she was born. She imagined him walking this same dust, breathing this same heat, decades and a lifetime removed from the daughter who would spend her whole life trying to walk the same ground he'd disappeared into. Somewhere in this valley was an answer. She intended to find it, whatever the cost. The records room at Widow's Reach was smaller than a supply closet and smelled like mildew and burnt coffee. A specialist named Priya Anand ran it with the tired efficiency of someone who'd stopped expecting anyone to ask for anything more complicated than a leave form. Wren asked for something more complicated. "I need archived mission files," she said. "Regional operations, 1991. Anand blinked at her. "That's not even this war." "I know what war it's from. That stuff's not even supposed to be at a forward base. Most of it's back in Belvoir, sealed." "Most of it," Wren said. "Not all of it." Because she'd done her research. Because certain field units kept regional shadow files, informal copies, the kind of paper trail nobody bothered destroying because nobody thought anyone would ever come looking, almost 3 decades later. Anand studied her for a long beat. "You know how many regs I'd be breaking. I know how many people got left behind because somebody followed every one of those regs to the letter," Wren said. "I'm not asking you to break anything permanent. I'm asking you to let me read." Silence. Which was Anand's way of saying yes without saying it. She came back that night after the mess hall emptied and the generators hummed their low, steady note into the dark, and Anand led her into a back room stacked with gray boxes that hadn't been opened in years. Wren found the box marked with a regional designation that matched her father's last known coordinates. Her hands weren't steady when she lifted the lid, which surprised her, because she could hold a rifle at 2,000 yards without a tremor, but this was different. This was the closest she'd ever physically been to the truth about the man who raised her without ever once being in the room. Inside mission logs, after-action summaries, and 3 pages, exactly 3, with black bars drawn through entire paragraphs, redacted so thoroughly that only fragments survived. Team encountered unexpected resistance near coordinates, radio contact lost at approximately. Decision made by Field Command to... She stared at that last line until the words blurred. Decision made by Field Command to... To what? The rest of the sentence didn't exist anymore. Someone had made sure of that. She photographed every page with a small camera she'd smuggled in her boot, carefully, methodical, her breathing gone shallow and controlled the way it did on the range, because panic was a luxury, because panic got people killed, because if she let herself feel what was rising in her chest right now, she would not be able to stop it, and stopping things was the only skill that had ever kept her alive. She sat back on her heels in the cramped little room, the single overhead bulb buzzing faintly above her, and tried to organize what she'd found into something that made sense. A convoy hit. A team encountering unexpected resistance, radio contact lost. And then that sentence cut off at the exact moment it might have told her something true. Decision made by Field Command to abandon the position, to pull support, to leave 4 men in the open because extracting them carried a risk somebody higher up the chain wasn't willing to accept. She didn't know. That was the maddening part. She had a fragment of a sentence and 27 years of silence, and none of it added up to an answer. Only to more questions stacking on top of each other like sandbags against a flood that kept rising anyway. At the bottom of the box beneath the logs was a single photograph, faded. Four men in desert fatigues, arms slung around each other's shoulders, squinting into a sun that had set decades ago. She recognized her father instantly. The same jaw she saw every morning in the mirror, the same set to the eyes. Standing beside him, unnamed in any caption, was a man with a mustache and a look on his face that didn't match the others' easy grins. A look like he already knew something the rest of them didn't. She didn't know his name, not yet. But she photographed his face too, and something cold moved through her chest as she did it. Because instinct told her this stranger mattered. Instinct had never been wrong before. Anand appeared in the doorway around midnight, arms crossed, expression unreadable in the poor light. "You've been in here 3 hours." "Has it been 3 hours?" "Wren." It was the first time Anand had used her first name. "Whatever you're looking for, I hope you find it. But you should know people who go digging in old boxes around here sometimes find things that were buried on purpose." Wren looked up at her. "You think somebody buried this on purpose?" "I think," Anand said carefully, "that a war a lot of people would rather forget doesn't usually get remembered by accident. And I think you should be careful who you tell about what's in that box." "I haven't told anyone." "God," Anand said. "Keep it that way." She left without another word, and Wren sat alone in the humming quiet, staring at the photograph of four men who trusted each other in a world that no longer existed, and one man among them who did not. She memorized his face, the set of his jaw, the particular stillness in his eyes that the other three men in the photo did not share, as though he'd already made a decision the rest of them hadn't been told about yet. She would find out who he was. She had to. Because somewhere between that photograph and this room, decades of silence had turned into a debt that somebody in this valley still owed her family, whether they knew it yet or not. 3 days later, the convoy rolled out at 0500, headlights off, engines low, the valley still holding on to the last of the night's cold before the sun came up and turned everything to fire. Wren rode in the lead MRAP as designated overwatch, scanning the ridgelines through her scope while the vehicles wound through a pass locals called the Snake because of the way the road doubled back on itself along the canyon wall. Ruiz sat across from her, checking his rifle for the third time in 20 minutes. A nervous habit. Or maybe not nervous. Maybe just old. "You slept?" he asked. "Some." "That records room. Anand mentioned you'd been in there. Late." Wren kept her eyes on the ridge. "Insomnia." "Right." He didn't push, but she saw him tuck the answer away somewhere behind his eyes, the same way he'd done with her name on the flight line. "This valley's quiet lately. Too quiet, some say." "Quiet's not a bad thing." "Quiet's exactly a bad thing," he said. "Quiet means somebody's waiting." He wasn't wrong. The first RPG hit the third vehicle in the convoy at 0547, and the world came apart in fire and noise and the particular scream of metal tearing that no training exercise ever fully prepares you for. Wren was moving before her brain finished processing the sound. Out of the MRAP into a firing position against a boulder the size of a delivery truck, scope up, breath already slowing into the rhythm her body knew better than fear. Muzzle flashes stitched the ridgeline above them, dozens, too many for a simple ambush. This wasn't harassment fire, this was coordinated. Contact left, someone was screaming over the radio. "Multiple positions, we are taking heavy fire." Wren found a shooter in her scope, squeezed. He dropped, found another, fired. Missed by inches as he ducked behind cover a half-second before her round arrived. Because someone up there was good. Because someone up there was better than the average insurgent fighter had any right to be. Because the pattern of fire wasn't spraying the convoy evenly. It was converging on her position. Rounds chewed the dirt 6 inches from her elbow, then a foot from her boot, then close enough that she felt the wind of one passing her ear like a hot whisper. Which didn't make sense. Except it made perfect sense if someone up there already knew exactly where the American sniper would set up. Exactly which boulder. Exactly which angle. Which meant someone had been watching this convoy long before it left the wire. Which meant this wasn't a coincidence. Which meant, "Callahan, move." Ruiz's voice right behind her, and then his hand on her shoulder, yanking her sideways a half second before a round punched through the exact spot where her head had been. She rolled, came up firing, took down the shooter who'd nearly ended her, a clean shot through cover that shouldn't have been possible, and was anyway because her hands didn't shake even when the rest of her wanted to. A third shooter opened up from a different angle, and this time the rounds walked closer, kicking dirt across her forearm, hard enough to sting through her sleeve. She didn't flinch. Couldn't afford to. Instead, she rolled left, came up on one knee behind a smaller rock and found him in her scope before he could reposition. Because that was the thing about being small. People underestimated how fast you could move when the ground gave you no other choice. The shot took him center mass. He folded backward, out of sight, and for a half second the ridge above them went quiet enough that she could hear her own pulse hammering against her eardrums. Then it started again. Worse, because whoever was directing this ambush had realized his first two shooters had failed and was now committing more of them, a coordinated push from three separate positions that no simple insurgent cell should have been capable of organizing. This wasn't opportunistic fire from fighters who'd stumbled onto a convoy. This was planned, rehearsed, timed to the exact minute the vehicles would enter the narrowest stretch of the pass where the canyon walls left almost no room to maneuver and almost no cover beyond the handful of boulders scattered along the roadside like afterthoughts. Wren's mind, even through the adrenaline, even through the ringing in her ears and the smell of cordite thick enough to taste, kept circling back to the same impossible question. How did they know exactly where the overwatch position would be? How did they know to concentrate three separate firing positions on one soldier out of 40 when in years of fighting in this valley the enemy had never once demonstrated this kind of precision against a moving convoy? Unless somebody had told them where to look. A round snapped past her ear close enough that she felt the heat of it, and she dropped, flat cheek in the dirt, every instinct screaming that the position was no longer safe, that whoever was calling shots on that ridge had adjusted for her exact posture and was walking rounds toward her like a man closing a door. "Callahan, we need you back on that gun." Ruiz's voice hoarse somewhere to her left through the chaos. "Two more wounded. We've got nobody covering the eastern approach." She forced herself up, forced her hands steady, found a new position, 20 feet to her right behind a slab of rock, still warm from the morning sun, and went back to work. Target. Breath. Squeeze. A shooter dropped near the ridgeline's northern edge. Target. Breath. Squeeze. Another fell silent in the scrub brush where he'd been trying to flank the convoy's rear vehicle. She lost count of how many rounds she fired, lost track of time the way she always did when the work took over, when the part of her brain that could feel fear got quietly locked away behind the part that could still do the job. The air support arrived at the 11-minute mark, two Apaches screaming low over the ridge with a sound that seemed to physically push the remaining fire into silence, and in the sudden quiet that followed, Wren became aware of things she hadn't had room to notice before. The taste of copper in her mouth from biting her own lip, the tremor finally starting in her hands now that the shooting had stopped, the particular high-ringing whine that would stay in her ears for days. The ambush lasted 11 minutes, felt like 11 years. When air support finally screamed overhead and the ridgeline went quiet, the convoy had lost one vehicle, 3 wounded, no dead. A miracle by the valley's standards. Wren sat with her back against the boulder, chest heaving, ears ringing, and looked down at the small crater a round had punched into the dirt beside her boot. Close enough to have taken her leg off, close enough that it hadn't been an accident. Ruiz crouched beside her, breathing hard, blood from a graze above his eyebrow, tracking down his jaw. "You all right?" "I'm fine." "That's not what I asked." She looked up at him, and for once, she let something honest show on her face, just for a second, before she folded it away again like a flag into a triangle. "They were shooting at me," she said. "Not the convoy. Me." Ruiz went still. He looked up at the now silent ridge, then back down at her, and something in his expression shifted into a wariness that hadn't been there an hour ago. "You sure?" "I've been doing this a long time, Sergeant. I know the difference between suppressive fire and a kill box." He didn't answer right away, which told her everything, because a man who'd done 3 tours in this valley knew exactly what it meant when the enemy narrowed its fire onto one soldier out of 40. It meant somebody wanted that soldier dead specifically, and somebody back at the FOB was going to want to know why. They medevaced the wounded first. Then the convoy limped back through the pass in the flat white light of full morning past burned-out husks of vehicles nobody had bothered to clear from years of other ambushes past a valley that looked in daylight almost peaceful. Wren said nothing the whole ride back. Her mind was somewhere else, running the numbers, running the angles, running the impossible coincidence of enemy fire finding her exact position on the exact day she'd spent 3 nights digging through a records box that was never supposed to leave Fort Belvoir. Because coincidences that clean didn't happen in war zones. Because somebody had known she'd be there, and somebody had known where to aim, which meant somebody on this base or somebody with access to this base's communications had told them. The medical tent at Widow's Reach was a controlled kind of chaos when they arrived. Doctors moving fast and low over stretchers, the smell of antiseptic and copper thick in the canvas heat. Wren waited near the entrance, unhurt, unneeded, watching medics work on soldiers who'd bled for a mistake that might not have been a mistake at all. A young flight surgeon named Captain Devon Pruitt caught her standing there and paused. "You're not hit." "No." "Then why do you look like you were?" Wren didn't answer, because there wasn't an answer that fit inside a sentence short enough for a medical tent. Pruitt didn't push. He had 3 patients waiting and a stretcher with a soldier missing part of his calf, and there wasn't time for anything except the next crisis. But before he turned away, he paused, looked at her once more, and said something that stuck with her longer than she wanted it to. "You've got the look," he said. "What look?" "The one people get right before they decide something's worth dying for." He shook his head, already moving back toward the wounded. "Be careful with that, Sergeant. This valley collects people who make that decision." She stood there a moment longer in the antiseptic light, the words settling into her like a stone dropped into still water. Ripples she couldn't quite stop from spreading. Because he wasn't wrong. She could feel it in herself, the shape of the decision already half made, the same hardening she'd felt as a child staring at a folded flag on a mantel and deciding long before she understood what the decision would cost her that she would spend her life finding out the truth no matter where it led. She walked back to her quarters through a base gone quiet with exhaustion, past soldiers cleaning weapons, with the particular silence of men and women who had almost died that morning and didn't yet have the words for it. And she thought about her father, walking this same kind of silence decades ago and 80 kilometers away in the last hours before the desert swallowed him whole. That evening she was called into the operations center, not for debrief, for something colder than that. A major she didn't recognize sat behind a folding table, files stacked in front of him, expression carefully blank in the way officers train themselves to be blank when they were about to say something unpleasant. "Staff Sergeant Callahan," he said, "we need to talk about the ambush pattern."
"Sir, multiple witnesses report the enemy concentrated fire directly on your position. Sustained, accurate, which is unusual." He let that word sit in the air a moment. "Unusual enough that some people are asking how the enemy knew exactly where to find you." Wren kept her spine straight, kept her voice level. "I'd like to know that too, sir."
"Would you?" He opened a folder. Inside she caught a glimpse of her own transfer request, the one that had taken 4 months and a dozen interviews to approve. "You requested this posting, this valley by name. Care to tell me why?" Because her father disappeared 80 kilometers from where they were sitting? Because they were 3 redacted pages in a records box that shouldn't have existed? Because she'd spent 6 years of her life building toward this exact conversation, and she still wasn't ready to say any of it out loud to a man she'd known for exactly 1 day. "Personal reasons, sir." "Personal reasons," he repeated. "Got a soldier nearly killed today. Personal reasons that might mean the enemy has better information about our movements than we do." The accusation sat between them, unspoken but unmistakable. Not that she was a coward, not that she'd failed, something worse. That she might somehow, without meaning to be the reason the leak existed at all. "I would never compromise this unit," she said, quiet, steady, the same voice she used to call wind speed at 2,000 yards. Not for any reason. Then you won't mind, the major said, if we look a little closer at what you've been doing since you got here. She thought of the records room, of Anand who'd risked her own career letting her in, of the photographs on the camera hidden in her boot, the redacted pages, the face of the unnamed man standing beside her father in a photo taken before she was born. "No, sir," she said. "I won't mind." But she minded everything. The major closed the folder, leaned back in his chair, studying her with the particular exhaustion of a man who had seen too many strange coincidences in this valley to trust any of them. "Let me tell you what worries me, Staff Sergeant. It's not that you have a personal reason for being here. Soldiers have personal reasons for all kinds of things. What worries me is the timing. You arrive, you spend 3 nights in the records room doing God knows what, and on the 4th day the enemy executes the most coordinated, precisely targeted ambush this valley has seen in 8 months, aimed almost entirely at you." He spread his hands. "Walk me through how that isn't a pattern." "I can't walk you through it, sir, because I don't know the answer either." "That's not reassuring." "No," she agreed. "It isn't." He studied her a moment longer, and something in his expression shifted, not quite softening, but recalibrating the look of a man deciding whether he was dealing with a threat or a casualty. "Off the record," he said finally. "You understand how this looks. A soldier requests a hard transfer to a valley for unstated personal reasons, starts digging through archived files the same week she arrives, and within 72 hours the enemy demonstrates intelligence capabilities they've never shown before, all of it aimed at her. If I were sitting where you're sitting, Callahan, I'd want somebody to believe me too. But belief isn't evidence, and until I have evidence, I have to treat this as a possible security concern. That means restricted movement. That means somebody reviewing your communications. That means, until this clears, you don't leave this base without an escort." "Understood, sir." "I hope it is." He gestured toward the door, the conversation apparently over. "Because if there's a leak in this valley, Callahan, and it turns out to run through you, intentional or not, I will not be the one protecting your career. Do you understand me?" "Yes, sir." She stood saluted and walked out of the operations center into the cooling dark of early evening, her heart hammering in a way that had nothing to do with the ambush and everything to do with the sudden, vertiginous realization that she was no longer simply searching for the truth about her father. She had become a suspect in it. And somewhere in this valley, whoever had orchestrated that ambush now knew that their message had landed exactly as intended. Not just a warning, a leash. She didn't sleep that night either. She lay on her rack in the dark, listening to the generator hum and the far-off bark of a dog that had adopted the perimeter fence as its territory. And she thought about her mother's hands shaking every time the subject of 1991 came up. She thought about the flag folded into a triangle on the mantel. She thought about a man with a mustache and an old photograph standing next to her father, wearing an expression that didn't belong in a picture of soldiers who trusted each other. And she thought about 11 minutes of gunfire converging on one position out of 40, on the exact day she'd gone looking for a truth someone clearly still wanted buried. Because this wasn't over. Because whatever her father found in this valley decades ago, it hadn't died with him. It had been waiting. And now it knew her name. She closed her eyes, and for the first time since she was a child memorizing a stranger's face from photographs, she let herself feel something close to fear. Not for herself, for how far she was willing to go to find out the truth. Because there was no version of this that ended with her walking away. There was only the truth, or there was nothing at all. And Wren Callahan had never once in her entire life chosen nothing. Outside, the wind picked up over the valley, sweeping dust across the wire, carrying with it the smell of cordite that hadn't quite settled from the morning. Somewhere out past the ridgeline, in villages and compounds she hadn't seen yet, someone was already planning the next move. She could feel it, the way you feel weather changing before the sky admits it. Something had started today, something that would not stop until either she had her father's name cleared and his body found, or until the valley finally succeeded in doing to the daughter what it had done to the father decades and 80 kilometers away in a war that history had already tried to forget. She would not let it forget. Not while she was breathing. Not while she still had a trigger finger and a reason to use it. The generator hummed on into the dark, and somewhere in that hum underneath it, she thought she could hear her father's voice from the old training tapes he'd recorded before he shipped out the last time. Tapes her mother had kept in a shoebox for decades because she couldn't bear to throw them away and couldn't bear to listen to them either. Wind lies to you twice, Wren, before it tells the truth. She'd waited 27 years for the truth. She could wait a little longer, but not much. Somewhere past midnight, unable to sleep, she pulled a small photograph from the inside pocket of her uniform, where she kept it, worn soft at the edges from years of handling. Her father, young, unguarded, laughing at something outside the frame in a moment nobody had thought to explain to her before he became a name on a headstone instead of a man in a kitchen. She had never known his laugh. Never known the sound of his voice except through 3 scratchy training tapes her mother had refused to throw away and refused to play. Now, for the first time in her life, she was close enough to something real that she could feel it in the air, like a change in weather. A name in a photograph. A stranger with a mustache and a look that didn't belong among trusted men. A sentence cut off at the exact moment it might have told her what really happened in that valley decades ago. She thought about the Major's warning. Restricted movement, monitored communications, a leash disguised as caution. It wouldn't stop her. Nothing left in this world could stop her, not after coming this close. If anything, the ambush had confirmed what she already suspected. Somebody in this valley still had a reason to make sure Eli Callahan's story stayed buried. Which meant the story mattered. Which meant it was still alive, waiting for someone stubborn enough to dig it back up. She would be that person. Every long night on the range, every redacted page memorized, every question her mother couldn't answer, all of it had been building toward this moment. Tomorrow she would find out who the man in the photograph was, whatever it cost her. Because some debts didn't expire after almost 3 decades. They just waited, patient as stone, for someone willing to finally collect them. The dark outside her window held its silence, the valley breathing slow around the base like something ancient and unbothered by the small human wars fought across its skin. And Wren Callahan closed her eyes at last, not to rest, but to gather herself for whatever the morning would demand. She did not yet know his name, but she would. And when she did, everything about this valley, this war, and the 27-year-old lie at the center of both was going to change. Morning came gray and thin, the sun still low enough that the guard towers threw long shadows across the wire. Wren hadn't slept more than an hour, and it showed in the way her hands moved a fraction slower than usual when she checked her rifle, a fraction slower than the discipline she'd spent a lifetime building could quite forgive. Okafor found her at the mess hall, 2 trays of something that passed for eggs balanced in his hands, and sat across from her without asking permission. "You look like hell," he said. "Thank you. I mean it as a diagnosis, not an insult. You need to eat something before you fall over." She looked down at the tray he'd set in front of her and realized, distantly, that she couldn't remember the last time she'd actually finished a meal since arriving in this valley. Everything since the transfer had funneled into a single narrow channel of purpose, and food had become an afterthought somewhere along the way. "They think I'm the leak," she said quietly, keeping her voice below the clatter of the mess hall around them. Okafor didn't look surprised. "I heard. Word travels fast. Word always travels fast on a base this size. Everybody already knows the enemy walked rounds within inches of your head yesterday, and everybody's already got a theory about why." He took a bite of eggs that didn't look like they deserved the enthusiasm he gave them. "For what it's worth, my theory doesn't involve you selling anybody out." "What's your theory?" "That you're chasing something in this valley that predates either of us, and whatever it is, somebody with a very long memory doesn't want you finding it." He shrugged like the observation cost him nothing, though Wren suspected it cost him more than he was letting on. "I've watched you read old files by flashlight for 3 nights running, Callahan, I'm your spotter. It's my job to notice what you're aiming at even when you think nobody's looking. Wren studied him for a long moment, weighing exactly how much to say. But something in his steady, unhurried patience reminded her of the discipline her father's training manuals had tried to teach her from the far side of 2 decades of silence. Trust, given carefully, given only after it had been earned, was still trust. "My father went missing in this province," she said finally. 1991. I've spent my whole life trying to find out what happened to him. Okafor set down his fork. "That's not personal reasons," he said slowly. "That's the whole reason. It's the same thing from where I'm sitting." "No, it isn't. Personal reasons is a phrase officers use when they don't want to write the truth in a file. What you just told me is a reason a person builds an entire life around." He studied her with something that looked, for the first time since she'd met him, less like professional curiosity and more like genuine concern. "You understand what you're risking, don't you? Not just your career. Whoever ordered that ambush yesterday knows exactly why you're here now, too. That makes you a bigger target today than you were the day before." "I know. And you're not going to stop." It wasn't a question. She answered it anyway. "No," she said, "I'm not." He held her gaze a moment longer, then nodded slowly, the particular nod of a man deciding, without needing to say so out loud, exactly how far he was willing to go beside her. "Then you're going to need somebody watching your back who actually knows what they're watching for," he said. "Lucky for you, that happens to be my job description." Something in Wren's chest loosened just slightly, the first small mercy she'd allowed herself since stepping off the resupply flight days earlier. Not safety, not yet, but something adjacent to it. The particular relief of not being entirely alone in a valley that had already tried once to make sure she never left it. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me yet." He picked his fork back up, the moment already folding itself back into the ordinary rhythm of breakfast in a war zone. "Eat your eggs, Callahan. Whatever's coming, you're not going to survive it on an empty stomach." She ate. Not because she was hungry, but because he was right, and because some part of her recognized that the war she'd actually come here to fight was only beginning, and every ounce of strength she could hold on to now was going to matter later in ways she couldn't yet fully calculate. Outside the mess hall, the valley stretched gray and silent toward a ridgeline that had tried to kill her less than a day earlier, holding its secrets the way it had held them for almost 30 years, patient, indifferent, waiting to see whether the daughter would prove more stubborn than the desert that had swallowed her father whole. She intended to find out. Restricted movement, that was the phrase they used. Like she was a hazard, like she was weather. Wren Callahan spent 4 days confined to the wire at Widow's Reach, her radio checked twice a day, her name on a list somebody kept in a drawer. She didn't complain. Complaining was a language for people who still believed complaining worked. Instead, she watched, because watching was free. Because watching didn't require permission slips or signatures or a major's approval. And because somewhere in this base, somebody had known exactly where to point an ambush, and that somebody was still walking around drinking bad coffee like nothing had happened. She started with the operations center. Who came? Who went? Who lingered by the radio racks a beat too long? She logged the small things. A supply sergeant who avoided eye contact 3 days running. A radio operator who took an unusual number of personal calls on a line that wasn't supposed to carry personal calls at all. None of it added up to anything. Not yet. Because that was the discipline her father's manuals had taught her without ever meaning to. Patience wasn't a virtue. It was a tool. You didn't rush the shot because rushing the shot was how you missed, and missing in this kind of hunt didn't just cost her a target, it cost her the truth, which was how she noticed Colonel Harmon Voss. He wasn't her chain of command, not directly. He ran logistics coordination for the whole sector, a silver-haired officer with the kind of handshake that made men trust him before he'd said a single word. 33 years in. A chest full of ribbons. The sort of career that read on paper like something to admire. Except Except he checked the convoy schedules 3 times the morning of the ambush. Except he'd requested personally the exact route Wren's convoy took through the pass, a route that wasn't standard, a route somebody had to choose on purpose.
Except when she brought him coffee on her 5th day of restricted movement, trying to look like nothing more than a soldier making conversation, his hands shook. Just slightly. Just enough that the cup rattled against the saucer before he caught it. Men who'd done 33 years didn't usually have hands that shook over coffee. She'd watched him after that, careful, patient, the way she'd watch a target that hadn't yet stepped into a clean line of sight. He ran his sector with a kind of performance she recognized now that she was looking for it. Loud confidence in briefings, a joke ready for every junior officer who crossed his path. The particular warmth of a man who wanted badly to be remembered as someone soldiers could trust. But underneath the performance, something else moved. She caught it in the way his eyes went to the door every time it opened, in the way he checked his own phone more than a man his rank should need to, in the long, unexplained pause before he answered any question that touched even lightly on the ambush. Because guilty men didn't always look guilty. Sometimes they looked exhausted, instead worn down by the effort of holding a lie steady for so long that the muscles required to hold it had started visibly to fail. She almost pitied him in the brief moments she let herself feel anything about him at all. Almost. Then she'd remember the crater beside her boot in that canyon pass close enough to have taken her leg off, and the pity would curdle into something colder and far more useful. She found Okafor in the motor pool that evening, elbow-deep in a Humvee engine that had given up somewhere outside Baghdad long before either of them arrived in country. "You're staring at Voss," he said without looking up. "I'm not staring at anybody. You've been staring at Voss for 3 days. I've watched you do it. You've got to look. Everybody keeps telling me I've got to look. Because you do!" He wiped his hands on a rag that hadn't seen soap in longer than either of them wanted to think about. "What did he do?" She glanced around the motor pool, checking the distance to the nearest mechanic, the angle of the open bay door, the particular geometry of who could overhear what. Old habits, the ones that kept people alive. "I think he's connected to my father's disappearance," she said quietly. "More than connected, I think he's involved." Okafor didn't look surprised. He'd earned that much trust already, over eggs at a mess hall table 2 mornings after an ambush that should have killed her, and she wasn't about to waste it now by treating him like a stranger. "Involved how?" "I don't know yet. He requested our route personally. He checked convoy logs 3 times the morning of the ambush. And a man with 33 years in doesn't get nervous over coffee unless something's eating him alive." Okafor set the rag down, looked at her properly for the first time. "You want my honest opinion?" "Always." "Careful who you say this to, because if you're wrong, you're finished. Career over, maybe worse. And if you're right..." He didn't finish the sentence. Didn't need to. The unfinished half hung there between them, heavier than anything he could have actually said, and Wren understood exactly what he meant without him ever saying the word. Dead. If she was right about Voss being right might get her killed before anyone believed her. "If I'm right, what if you're right?" he said. "Then somebody in this valley already knows you're close. And people who get close to Voss's kind of secret don't usually get a second ambush." She thought about that all night, the particular arithmetic of it. 1 warning already survived. A second one, statistically, wouldn't miss. She lay awake, replaying the ambush frame by frame the way she replayed every difficult shot afterward, hunting for the details she'd missed in the moment because the moment had been too loud to hear it clearly. The convoy route, who had access to it, who had reason to make sure that route on that morning ran through the narrowest part of the pass instead of the wider approach they'd used twice before. Because convoy routes weren't chosen at random, somebody signed off on them. Somebody with enough rank to override a platoon sergeant's preference for the safer road. She had a name now. She just didn't have proof, and proof was the only currency that mattered once you started making accusations against a full colonel. So she waited. And she watched.
And underneath the waiting, something in her chest kept tightening a little more each day, the ache of being close enough to smell the truth without being able to close her hand around it yet. The break came from somewhere she didn't expect. A message routed through a contact she'd made years ago at Fort Belvoir, a records clerk named Sasha Renner, who owed Wren a favor from a training exercise where Wren had covered for a mistake that would have ended Renner's career. Favors like that had long memories in the Army. Wren had learned to collect them carefully, the way her father must have, the way anyone survives a system built on paperwork and silence. The message was 3 lines long, encrypted through a channel that wasn't strictly authorized, and it landed on Wren's tablet like a depth charge. Voss Harmon T. Commissioned, 1985. First combat deployment, Gulf Theater, 1991. Assigned logistics support forward reconnaissance element designation, redacted. Same year, same theater, which meant Voss hadn't just been in the Gulf in 1991, which meant Voss had been connected in some capacity the Army still wasn't willing to fully declassify to the exact kind of mission her father had died on. Her hands were shaking now. Not from fear, from something closer to vertigo, the sensation of a floor tilting beneath her that she'd walked across 1,000 times without ever noticing it wasn't level. 6 years of range work had taught her to trust her hands above almost anything else in her life, and now, here they were, trembling over a message on a screen instead of steady behind a scope. She read the message again, and again, until the words stopped being words and became something closer to a verdict. Because a colonel with 33 years, a nervous colonel, a colonel who personally selected convoy routes, had been present in theater the exact year her father vanished, that wasn't a coincidence. Coincidences didn't survive this many layers. She sat with the message a long time, the small glowing screen the only light in her quarters, and let herself do something she rarely allowed. She let herself imagine the shape of it. A young captain named Voss decades ago, standing somewhere in a command tent while a decision moved through the chain above him, a decision that would decide whether 4 men lived or died. She imagined her father on the other end of a radio that barely worked, waiting for an answer that never came, the way he needed it to. She didn't know yet whether Voss had made that decision himself or simply carried it out. The message from Renner didn't say. It only confirmed what her instincts had already been screaming since the moment his hands shook over a coffee cup. He was there. He was connected. And connected men, in her experience, rarely stayed connected to something this dangerous by accident. She called her mother that night using the 20 minutes of satellite phone time soldiers were allotted for family, sitting alone behind a stack of shipping containers where nobody could overhear. "Mom, Wren." Her mother's voice, thin with distance and static, still carried the particular warmth it always had. The sound of a woman who'd spent 27 years being both mother and father and had never once let the weight of it show in front of her daughter. "It's late there. You all right?" There was a small pause before the question, the pause of a mother who'd learned over decades of late-night calls from deployed daughters exactly how much dread could live inside 4 ordinary words. "I need to ask you something. About Dad?" A pause on the line, long enough that Wren could hear the quality of her mother's silence, the one that meant she was bracing. "Okay. Did you ever hear the name Voss, Harmon Voss?" Another pause, longer this time. "Where did you hear that name?" "Mom." "Where, Wren?" "He's here, in theater, right now. Same unit, structure, same sector, and he was in the Gulf the same year Dad—" "Stop." Her mother's voice cracked just slightly on the word. "Stop right there. You know the name. I heard it, once, a long time ago." Her mother exhaled, and Wren could picture her exactly standing in the kitchen in Abilene, one hand braced against the counter, the way she always did when the past came looking for her. "Your father mentioned him, in a letter. Before the last deployment. He said there was a man in his unit he didn't trust. Didn't give a reason, just said if anything ever happened to him, I should remember the name." Wren's chest went tight enough that she had to remind herself consciously to breathe. "You never told me this." Because what was I supposed to do with it, Wren?
A name and a letter from a man who never came home.
I had a baby to raise. I couldn't chase ghosts and raise a daughter at the same time. So I put the letter away and I told myself it didn't matter anymore, and I tried to build a life that didn't depend on an answer I was never going to get.
I need that letter. It's in the cedar box, top shelf of my closet. I'll scan it tonight. Mom, Wren. Her mother's voice steadied, found something firm underneath the static. Whatever you're doing over there, whatever this is turning into, be careful. I already buried a version of your father once. I don't intend to bury the daughter who looks exactly like him too. The line went quiet after that, both of them sitting in their separate silences, an ocean and a war apart, bound together by a name neither of them had wanted to say out loud. Mom. Yes. Why didn't you ever tell me there was a letter? Her mother was quiet for a long moment, and when she finally spoke, her voice had thinned into something Wren had heard only a handful of times in her life, usually late at night, usually when she thought her daughter was already asleep. Because letters like that don't bring anybody home, Wren. They just give you somewhere new to bleed. I read that letter so many times the paper started falling apart at the folds, and every single time I hoped it would say something different. It never did. Eventually, I had to choose between raising a daughter and drowning in a piece of paper, and I chose you. I chose you every single day for 27 years. I'm not going to apologize for that. I'm not asking you to apologize, I know. A breath, shaky, then steadying. But I can hear it in your voice anyway. That same hunger your father had. The one that made him volunteer for the hardest missions instead of the safest ones. I used to lie awake wondering if I'd raised you to have it too, or if it was just something you were born carrying, like his eyes, like his jaw. Now, I think I already know the answer. Mom, I have to do this. I know that too, her mother said, and something in her voice broke and rebuilt itself in the space of a single sentence. I just need you to understand what it cost me to let you leave the first time, and what it will cost me if I have to bury you the same way I never got to bury him. Wren closed her eyes, the satellite phone warm against her ear, the hum of the bass a distant, ordinary sound against the enormity of what her mother had just said. I love you, she said. It felt insufficient. It was the only thing large enough to say. I love you too. Now go find whatever's waiting for you over there, and Wren, if it's him, if it's really him. You call me before you do anything else, you understand me? Before anything. I promise. The letter arrived encrypted 2 days later, photographed in her mother's careful scan the paper, yellowed at the edges. Her father's handwriting slanted and hurried in a way that suggested he'd written it fast, maybe the night before deployment, maybe with less time than he wanted. Marion. If you're reading this, and I'm not there to explain it, something happened I couldn't control. There's a man in my unit named Voss. Logistics, not field, but he's been asking questions he shouldn't be asking. About our extraction routes, about timing. I don't have proof of anything, just a feeling I've learned not to ignore. If anything happens to me, remember that name. Don't go looking for it yourself. Just remember it. And if the day ever comes that someone needs to know, tell them. Wren sat with the letter open on her tablet for a long time, the bass humming around her in its evening rhythms, soldiers moving between mess and motor pool and rack. None of them aware that 20 feet away, a woman was reading a message from a dead man that had waited decades to reach the person it was actually meant for. She traced the slant of his handwriting with one finger against the cold glass of the tablet screen as close as she would ever come to touching something he'd actually touched. He'd written fast. She could see it in the way certain letters trailed off, the way a word here and there had been crossed out and rewritten. A man, racing against a deployment clock to leave behind whatever warning he could manage. He hadn't known he was writing his own eulogy. He'd thought he was being careful, thorough, the kind of soldier who covered every contingency before stepping into the unknown. He couldn't have known that the contingency would become the whole story, that a stray sentence about a nervous logistics officer would end up decades later as the single thread his daughter would use to unravel everything.
Her father hadn't known what Voss was doing, but he'd known enough to be afraid of it. And now Wren was standing in the exact valley where that fear had apparently come true, watching the same man's hands shake over a cup of coffee, a lifetime and a war later, still carrying whatever secret had cost her father everything. She closed the tablet, sat very still, because the next move mattered more than any shot she'd ever taken at 2,000 yards. Because if she moved too fast, Voss would bury the truth deeper than the desert already had. And if she moved too slow, the next ambush might not leave anyone standing to ask the questions at all. She showed the letter to Okafor first, not because she needed his permission, but because a decision this large deserved a witness who understood exactly what it might cost her. He read it twice, sitting on an ammo crate outside the motor pool, the evening light going gold and thin around them. He knew, Okafor said, quietly handing the tablet back. Your father knew something was wrong before it even happened. That's not a hunch, Callahan. That's a warning written by a man who suspected he was already running out of time. Which means Voss has known this whole time that somebody might come looking eventually. Which means confronting him alone is either the bravest thing you've ever done or the last mistake you'll ever make. Something shuddered behind Okafor's eyes, the closest she'd seen him come to open worry. I want to be in the room when you do it. You can't be. If this goes the way I think it might, I need him talking to me and only me. Adding a witness changes what he's willing to say. Then I'll be close enough to hear if it goes wrong. She didn't argue. Some offers weren't meant to be refused, only accepted with the gratitude they deserved. She found her opening 3 nights later when Voss stayed late in the operations center alone, reviewing logistics reports under a single desk lamp while the rest of the base slept. She knocked, waited for permission she wasn't sure she needed. Colonel? He looked up and something crossed his face before he could smooth it away. Not surprise, exactly. Recognition. The look of a man who'd been waiting for a knock like this for longer than he wanted to admit. She'd rehearsed this moment a dozen ways on the walk over. Confrontation, diplomacy, a version where she simply laid the letter on his desk and let the silence do the work for her. In the end, none of the rehearsed versions survived contact with the actual room, the actual man, the actual weight of 33 years of service sitting across a desk from 27 years of grief. Staff Sergeant Callahan. He gestured to the chair across from his desk. Little late for a visit. I won't take much of your time, sir. Take whatever you need. She sat, studied him, let the silence stretch longer than comfort allowed, a technique she'd learned on the range. The patience of waiting for the wind to settle before taking the shot. I have a letter, she said finally, from my father, Master Sergeant Eli Callahan, written before his last deployment in 1991. Voss's face didn't move, but his hand resting on the desk curled slightly, knuckles whitening. I don't know that name. You do. Staff Sergeant, he wrote my mother a letter, sir, before he disappeared. He named you specifically, said you were asking questions about extraction routes, said if anything happened to him, she should remember your name. The silence that followed was the longest of Wren's life, longer than 11 minutes of gunfire and a canyon pass, longer than every night she'd spent staring at a mantel, wondering what happened to the man whose photograph sat on it. Voss's shoulders dropped, just slightly. The posture of a man finally setting down a weight he'd carried so long he'd forgotten it had a shape. You should leave this alone, he said, quiet, almost gentle. For your own sake. I can't. You can. Most people can. Most people learn to live with the questions they can't answer. I'm not most people. No. He looked at her for a long moment, something like grief moving behind his eyes. You're not. You're exactly like him. That's what makes this so much worse. He told her, eventually, in pieces, the way men tell the truth when the truth has been rotting in them for decades and finally finds a crack to escape through. In 1991, he'd been a young captain, assigned to logistics support for a reconnaissance element operating deep behind enemy lines. Her father's team. 4 men dropped in to locate and mark mobile missile launchers before coalition forces could strike them. The mission went wrong on the second night. A local militia commander, a man whose name Voss said like it still tasted like ash, discovered the team's position and cut off their planned extraction route. Voss had the authority in that narrow window to authorize an alternate extraction, a riskier route, but one that gave the team a chance. He didn't authorize it. He stood, walked to the small window of the operations center, looking out at a darkness that held nothing but wire and dust and the shapes of parked vehicles, as though the story might be easier to tell with his back turned. "Your father's team went in clean," he said. 4 men, good men. The mission was simple on paper. Locate mobile launchers, mark them, get out before dawn. But the militia in that sector was better organized than anyone anticipated, and by the second night they'd found the team's position and cut off the planned extraction corridor. "There was a decision made above me," he said, and for the first time his voice cracked, the polished 33-year veneer finally splitting down the middle. "Command decided the risk to the extraction aircraft was too high. They pulled support. I was ordered to relay the decision. I was the one who told your father's team over a radio that barely worked that nobody was coming." Wren's chest had gone completely still, the way it did before a shot, every part of her narrowing down to this one unbearable moment. "You left them." "I followed orders." "You left them." "Yes." He said it plainly now, no more hiding behind rank or procedure. "I left them. And I have lived with that decision every day since, Staff Sergeant. Every single day." "Then why?" Wren said, her voice low and dangerous in a way she barely recognized as her own. "Did somebody ambush my convoy the week I started asking questions about it? Why did somebody know exactly where to find me? You want me to believe you've spent decades drowning in guilt, but guilt doesn't leak convoy routes to insurgents." Voss flinched like she'd struck him. "That wasn't me." "Then who?" He was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice had dropped to something barely above a whisper, the sound of a man confessing the second half of a sin he thought he'd buried alongside the first. "The militia commander who cut off the extraction in 1991. He's still alive, Callahan, still active in this valley. His name is Farouk Nassar, and 8 months ago he found out I was stationed here. He sent word. He knew what I did in 1991. He knew I never reported it accurately. He's been using that knowledge ever since to move information through this base whenever it suits him." "You're telling me you've been feeding him convoy intelligence?" "I'm telling you," Voss said, and his hands finally stopped shaking, settling into something like resignation, "that I've been trapped between a truth I couldn't survive and a man who's held it over my head for months. When your transfer came through, when your name matched the file he'd apparently kept for decades, he told me exactly what he wanted. Convoy routes, timing, enough information to isolate you without touching the rest of the convoy. How does a man like that even reach you?" Wren said. "Across a border, across a war. How does a militia commander get a message to a full colonel on an American base without anyone noticing? You'd be surprised how porous these valleys are, Callahan. Money moves, messages move. A local contractor delivers supplies to this base twice a week, and 8 months ago he delivered something else along with the crates of bottled water. A photograph. Me, decades younger, standing beside a radio in 1991, the exact night I told your father's team nobody was coming. Underneath it, a single sentence. I remember everything. Do you?" He turned back to face her now, and the shame on his face was the most honest thing Wren had seen from him since she'd walked into the room. "I should have reported it immediately," he said. "I should have gone to my commanding officer the moment that photograph landed on my desk and told him everything. Consequences be damned. Instead, I did what cowards do. I calculated. I told myself I could manage it, give him small things, nothing that would get anyone killed, just enough to keep him quiet." His voice dropped almost to nothing. "I told myself that for 8 months. Right up until the morning your convoy rolled into that pass, and I understood, watching the reports come in, exactly how badly I had lied to myself." Wren felt the floor tilt again. Worse this time. Worse than the message about Voss's deployment history. Worse than anything since the day she opened her father's redacted file and read 3 words that changed her life. He wanted me, specifically. He's wanted your father's family, Voss said, since the night he watched an American extraction team disappear into ground he controlled. He didn't kill your father that night, Callahan. I don't believe he did. I think... He stopped, swallowed. I think there's a reason this has taken decades to surface. And I think you need to hear the rest of it from someone who isn't me. She should have felt rage. Some part of her had expected to, had braced for it the whole walk over, certain that whatever Voss confessed would detonate something violent in her chest that she'd have to fight to control. Instead, what she felt was closer to grief, a colder, quieter thing than rage. Because rage needed a villain simple enough to hate cleanly, and Voss wasn't that. He was a frightened, young captain who'd made one unforgivable choice under pressure, and then spent 33 years becoming exactly the kind of officer who could convince himself right up until the moment it was too late that managing a blackmailer quietly was somehow the responsible thing to do. She almost understood him. That was the worst part. She almost understood how fear, given enough time and enough silence to work in, could calcify into something that looked from the outside like competence, like control, like a man who had everything handled. "Why are you telling me this now?" she asked. "You could have let me keep believing it was just an ambush." "Bad luck, enemy activity. You didn't have to hand me your career on a plate." Voss was quiet for a long moment, staring at his own hands as though they belonged to someone else. "Because I watched you walk out of that pass alive," he said, "after 11 minutes of fire that should have killed you 3 separate times, and I understood something I'd spent decades running from. Some debts don't stay buried just because you want them to. They wait for someone patient enough to dig them up. And Callahan, you were always going to be that someone. The moment I saw your name on the transfer request, I knew exactly whose daughter you were, and I knew exactly how this was going to end." "How does it end?" "I don't know yet," he admitted, "but I know it doesn't end with me protecting a lie for one more day." Wren sat in the dark of the empty operations center for a long time after Voss finished talking, the weight of everything he'd said pressing down on her chest like sandbags stacked one on top of another. A colonel who'd betrayed her father through cowardice, not malice. A militia commander who'd held that cowardice over Voss's head for decades, using it like a key to unlock American convoy intelligence whenever it suited him. And a sentence Voss refused to finish. "I think there's a reason this has taken decades to surface." Which meant there was more. Which meant somewhere in this valley, the story of what happened to her father wasn't finished the way she'd always assumed it was finished. Was in a closed chapter with an empty casket and a folded flag. It was still being written, and Farouk Nassar, the man responsible for the mission going wrong decades ago, was somehow still holding the pen. Okafor was waiting outside when she finally emerged, sitting on the same ammo crate, rifle across his knees, patient as a man who'd decided a long time ago exactly how far he was willing to go for someone who'd earned it. "Well," he said. She told him. All of it. The extraction that never came, the blackmail, the name Farouk Nassar spoken out loud for the first time in her presence, landing between them like something with weight and edges. Okafor listened without interrupting, his expression darkening with each new piece until she finished, and the silence settled over the motor pool like dust after an explosion. "Voss is finished," he said finally. "One way or another. Court-martial, dishonorable discharge, maybe worse depending on what battalion decides to do with a confession like that." "I know. Does that bother you?" She considered the question honestly before answering. "No. It should, maybe, but it doesn't. He had 33 years to do the right thing and did it in the last 5 minutes because I forced his hand. That's not redemption. That's just running out of road." "Fair." Okafor stood, stretching muscles that had gone stiff from waiting. "So what now? Now I find out who Farouk Nassar really is. and what he's been sitting on for decades that made it worth keeping a colonel on a leash instead of just killing him and burying the whole thing.
You think there's more? Voss all that said it. There's a reason this took decades to surface. That's not a man protecting a secret about a bad decision. That's a man protecting something bigger. Okafor studied her in the dim light, something unreadable moving behind his eyes. You know what I think? He said slowly. I think whatever Nassar's protecting isn't a secret at all.
I think it's a person.
The words landed harder than he probably intended, some instinct in him reaching a conclusion before either of them had the evidence to justify it out loud. But Wren felt it too, the same cold certainty settling into her chest, the shape of a possibility too large and too dangerous to say plainly yet. Don't, she said quietly. Don't say it. Not until we know for certain. All right. He nodded, respecting the boundary even as his eyes stayed steady on hers. But you're already thinking it. She was. She'd been thinking it in some buried, unacknowledged corner of her mind since the moment she read the words, "Case remains open," in a redacted file at 21 years old. She just hadn't let herself say it, not even privately, not even now, because hope deferred long enough curdled into something that hurt more than grief ever had, and she wasn't ready yet to survive being wrong about this. She didn't sleep. Couldn't, lay on her rack, running the arithmetic of what she now knew against what she still didn't, and somewhere around 3 in the morning, a knock came at her door, so quiet she almost missed it. Ruiz, alone, face drawn tight in the low light of the hallway. We need to talk, he said, somewhere private. It's 3 in the morning. I know what time it is, Callahan. I also know Voss called for an emergency meeting with Battalion Command an hour ago, and I know somebody's about to try burying this whole thing before it goes any further. He stepped inside without being invited, pulling the door shut behind him with the careful quiet of a man who'd learned over 3 tours exactly how far sound carried through plywood walls at 3 in the morning. You want to explain why a colonel with 33 years just requested an emergency call with battalion, using language my buddy in Camo says sounded like a man trying to get ahead of his own court-martial? I can't tell you everything. I'm not asking for everything. I'm asking you to trust me with enough to keep both of us from getting blindsided by whatever's about to happen next. He crossed his arms, studying her in the half-light. I've watched you for 2 weeks, Callahan. I've watched you request the hardest posting in this whole sector. I've watched you take fire that should have killed you and walk away asking harder questions instead of easier ones. Whatever this is, it's bigger than a personnel review. So I'm going to ask you one more time, and I want the truth this time, not the version you give majors in an operations center. Wren's pulse spiked. Barry, what you tell me? Ruiz's eyes searched her face, and for the first time since she'd arrived at Widow's Reach, she saw something in his expression that looked less like suspicion and more like an offer. Because I've been in this valley 3 tours, Callahan, and I've heard the name Nasser exactly twice. Both times, right before something in this sector went sideways in a way nobody could explain afterward. You know who he is. I know what he does, Ruiz said. I don't know why a staff sergeant with a thin personnel file just spent an hour alone with a full-bird colonel who looked like he'd aged 10 years walking out of that room, but I'm guessing it has something to do with why the enemy tried to kill you 4 days ago. He sat down heavily on the edge of her cot, the exhaustion of 3 tours finally showing through the careful professionalism he usually wore like armor. First tour, I lost 2 men to an ambush in a valley 2 clicks from here, he said. Command called it random enemy contact. I never believed that. Too clean, too well-timed. Same feeling I got watching your convoy get hit, if I'm honest with you. Some ambushes are the enemy getting lucky. Others are the enemy getting told exactly where to look. I've learned to tell the difference the hard way, and every instinct in me says what happened to you 4 days ago was the second kind. And you never reported it. I reported it, he said, something bitter creeping into his voice. Command called it inconclusive, moved on. That's the thing about a valley like this, Callahan. It swallows more than soldiers. It swallows questions, too, if you don't have enough rank or enough proof to make people listen.
Wren studied him, weighing exactly how much of her father's story this man had earned the right to hear. "My father," she said finally, "was Delta Force, missing since 1991. This valley, 80 kilometers from where we're standing." Ruiz didn't say anything for a long moment. When he did, his voice had gone quiet in a way that matched the hour. "Then you need to know something," he said. 2 days ago, before the ambush, a source in a village north of here reported a compound run by a commander answering to Nassar's description, heavily guarded, off the standard patrol routes. Command flagged it as low priority. Nobody's followed up. Why would they flag it low priority? Because the report also mentioned something Command didn't want spreading through the ranks, Ruiz said. A rumor from a local elder that the compound's been holding a prisoner, an American, for a very long time. The world went very quiet around Wren Callahan in that moment. Quiet the way it went right before a shot broke the wind, settling the target finally still. "How long?" she said, though some part of her already knew the answer before he gave it. Ruiz held her gaze. "A long time," he said. "Decades, if the elder's telling the truth." The words hit her like the recoil of a rifle she hadn't braced for. "Decades," she repeated, her voice sounding strange in her own ears, distant, as though someone else were speaking through her. The elder didn't give exact dates, said the prisoner arrived not long after the Gulf War ended, said he'd been moved between compounds over the years but always stayed under the same commander's control. Said the man was old now, gray, but alive, or he was as of 6 months ago when the elder last had any word. Why didn't anyone follow up on this? Because in a valley like this, rumors about American prisoners come through every few years. Callahan and 90% of them turn out to be nothing. Old wives' tales. Propaganda. Command's learned to be skeptical because chasing every rumor gets soldiers killed for nothing. I understand why they flagged it low priority. I don't agree with it, but I understand it. This one's different. Maybe. Maybe not. I'm not going to stand here and promise you it's him, Callahan, because that would be cruel, and you've had enough cruelty handed to you in the last 2 weeks without me adding to it. What I can promise you is that the timeline lines up, the location lines up, and the man who's apparently been holding this valley's secrets over Voss's head for decades is exactly the kind of man who'd keep a prisoner alive on purpose. Leverage doesn't work if the leverage is dead. Wren pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes, trying to hold back the flood threatening to break loose behind them. I need to see it, she said again, quieter this time. I need to see that compound with my own eyes. She didn't cry, wouldn't let herself, not yet, not with Ruiz watching and the whole base sleeping around them, and a truth this large, still too new to trust with tears. Instead, she sat with it, the way she'd been trained to sit with everything unbearable in her life. Still. Controlled. Cataloging details instead of feeling them, because feeling them fully would have broken something in her that she needed intact for whatever came next. Decades. An American prisoner. A compound 80 kilometers from where her father's convoy had gone dark, guarded by men answering to the commander who'd cut off his extraction and then spent decades blackmailing the officer responsible for abandoning him. It didn't prove anything. Not yet. Rumors from village elders weren't evidence. 27 years was a long time for a man to survive captivity and hope, she reminded herself with the same brutal discipline she used to steady a rifle, was a dangerous thing to build a mission on. But she'd spent her whole life believing the desert didn't give things back. What if it did? What if this whole time it had simply been waiting for someone patient enough, someone stubborn enough, someone with exactly her name and exactly her face to come and ask for it? I need to see that compound, she said. That's not a decision either of us gets to make alone, Ruiz said. Not without proof, not without approval from somebody a lot higher than a platoon sergeant and a staff sergeant with a grudge. This isn't a grudge, Sergeant. I know what it is, he said, softer than before. I've buried men, Callahan. I've written letters to mothers who never got a body to bury. I understand exactly what it does to a person having a question like this hang open for decades. I'm not questioning why you want to go.
I'm questioning how, because going in loud gets people killed and going in quiet takes proof we don't have yet. Then help me get proof. He studied her for a long moment, the weight of 3 tours and a career built on following procedure visible in the tired lines of his face, and then slowly he nodded. Against my better judgment, he said, yes, because if there's even a chance that rumor is true, Callahan, I'm not the kind of soldier who can walk away from it either. I've spent too many years watching this valley swallow good men without anyone asking hard enough questions afterward. Maybe it's time somebody finally did. Thank you. Don't thank me yet, he said, rising from the cot, his silhouette framed for a moment against the pale light leaking under the door. We don't have approval. We don't have proof strong enough to move a company forward, let alone convince battalion to greenlight anything near that compound. What we have is a rumor from an elder, a letter from a dead man, and a colonel who might change his mind about cooperating the second his own career is on the line. That's not a plan, Callahan. That's a prayer with good intentions. Then we build the plan. He allowed himself, finally, something close to a smile, tired but real. Get some sleep first. Tomorrow we start building it properly, step by step, the way it needs to be done, if we want any of us walking away from this. Outside, the valley held its breath in the dark, the way it always did in the hours before dawn, as if even the mountains understood that something enormous was about to move beneath its surface. Somewhere north of the base, behind walls nobody had bothered to look past in decades, a truth was waiting. And for the first time since she'd opened a redacted file at 21 years old and read 3 words that rearranged her entire life, Wren Callahan let herself believe, just barely, just enough to keep breathing through the terror of it, that her father might still be out there. She thought of her mother's voice on the satellite line, thin with static and 27 years of carefully rationed hope. Call me before you do anything else. She would. She promised herself that much, sitting in the dark with Ruiz beside her, and the whole valley holding its breath around them. Whatever came next, whatever the compound revealed when they finally laid eyes on it, her mother would not learn the truth second-hand through a phone call from a stranger or a folded flag delivered by men in dress uniforms. She would carry it home herself, however it ended. Wren rose from the edge of her cot, checked her rifle case out of habit more than necessity, and stood at the small window of her quarters, looking north toward a ridgeline she couldn't see in the dark but could feel anyway, the way you feel a held breath before it finally releases. Okafor found her there 20 minutes later, standing at the window in the same position, and didn't ask what she was thinking. He'd already guessed. "We'll go with you," he said simply. "Whatever Ruiz manages to put together, whatever the plan ends up looking like. You're not doing this one alone, Callahan. Not this one." "You don't have to." "I know." He leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, the particular stubbornness of a man who'd already made up his mind and wasn't interested in revisiting the decision. But some debts get collected as a team, or they don't get collected at all. You taught me that, actually. Watching you these past 2 weeks. Some things are worth more than the risk it takes to go after them. She didn't have an answer big enough for that. So she just nodded and let the silence between them carry the gratitude words couldn't quite manage. Somewhere out there behind walls nobody had bothered to look past in decades, a truth was waiting for his daughter to finally find him. They didn't get approval, not really. What they got was a narrow window, 48 hours granted by a battalion commander who listened to Ruiz's report, read Voss's written confession, and decided the risk of doing nothing outweighed the risk of doing something reckless. Voss made that decision easier, because 2 days after his confession, he walked into battalion headquarters himself and turned over 8 months of message logs, financial transfers, everything Nasser had used to control him. He didn't ask for leniency. He asked for one thing only. "Let her go," he told the colonel running the inquiry. "Whatever happens to me, let Callahan go find out the truth." It wasn't redemption. Wren understood that. Redemption required more than one honest confession after 33 years of silence, but it was something.
A door cracked open instead of slammed shut. She walked into the planning room that night with Ruiz Okafor and a six-man element pulled from a reconnaissance unit that specialized in exactly this kind of operation. Quiet, fast, deniable if it went wrong. The room smelled like burnt coffee and stale adrenaline satellite photographs pinned to a corkboard that had seen 100 other missions come and go without ever carrying this particular weight. Wren studied the compound's layout until the shapes burned themselves into memory. Every wall, every guard rotation, the intelligence team had managed to piece together from 6 months of intermittent surveillance nobody had prioritized until now.
This isn't a rescue mission, the operations major told them, laying out satellite imagery of the compound on a folding table. Officially, this is a reconnaissance and verification operation. If you confirm a prisoner, you extract if the situation allows it. If it doesn't allow it, you mark the location and we plan a larger operation with proper authorization.
With respect, sir, Wren said, if there's a man in that compound who's been alive for decades without proper authorization ever finding him, I'm not walking away because the paperwork isn't ready. The major studied her for a long moment. Something in his face suggested he'd expected exactly that answer, and had already decided somewhere behind his own carefully guarded expression not to fight her on it.
Then don't get caught doing something the paperwork doesn't cover, he said, because if this goes wrong, Callahan, I won't be able to protect you from what comes after.
Understood, sir.
Ruiz caught her eye across the table after the major left, something unspoken passing between them, the particular understanding of two soldiers who'd already decided, independent of any order, exactly how far they were willing to go tonight.
You don't have to lead the entry team, he said quietly, once the room had emptied enough that the words felt private. Nobody would think less of you sitting this one out. Not after everything you've already carried to get us here.
I have to lead it, Wren said. You know I do.
I know you think you do. There's no difference, Sergeant. Not tonight. He didn't argue further, just nodded, the particular nod of a man who understood exactly what it meant to owe a debt this large, and had decided, without needing to say so, that he'd carry his own share of it beside her. Okafor caught her before she left the planning room, waiting by the door with his rifle already slung and checked. You remember what I said, he said quietly, in the motor pool, about what Nassar might really be protecting? I remember. I meant it, Callahan. I've had a bad feeling about this since the letter, since Voss's confession. A man doesn't stay quiet for decades over a bad decision he made in 30 seconds. He stays quiet because the alternative is worse than the guilt. Because the alternative means admitting what he actually left behind out there. You think he's alive. I think, Okafor said carefully, that we're about to find out whether hope is a luxury or a plan. I just wanted you to know whatever's behind that door tonight, I'm not walking away from it either. She didn't sleep that night either. Lay on her rack running through the compound's layout until she could see it behind her closed eyes, every wall, every guard tower, every possible line of sight. Because in 6 hours, she would either confirm the worst things she'd ever imagined or the best things she'd never let herself hope for. Either way, there would be no going back to who she was before tonight. They moved before dawn, 4 vehicles and a 6-man element cutting north through terrain that grew rockier and more broken the farther they traveled from the wire. Wren rode in the lead vehicle beside Ruiz, rifle across her knees, mind quiet in the particular way it went quiet before every difficult shot she'd ever taken. The compound sat at the base of a rocky outcropping, exactly where satellite imagery had placed it. Mud brick walls high enough to block sightlines from the road. 2 guard towers, manned but not alert, the posture of men who'd grown complacent after decades of nobody looking hard enough to find them. Which was the mistake that would cost them everything. Because Wren Callahan had spent her whole life looking. The team moved into position under cover of the last hour of darkness, the recon element clearing the perimeter with the practiced silence of men who'd done this 100 times before. Wren took the eastern approach, with Ruiz and Okafor moving low along a dry wash that ran parallel to the compound's outer wall. Her heart
hammered against her ribs in a rhythm that had nothing to do with exertion, because somewhere behind that mud brick wall was either an answer or a dead end. And after 27 years of not knowing, the not knowing had somehow become easier to carry than the possibility of finding out for certain.
Except it was too late to turn back now. Except every step forward was already a commitment she couldn't undo. Except the only way through this was through it. They breached at 0512 a coordinated entry through 2 points that left the guards no time to organize a defense. Wren moved through the compound's inner courtyard with her rifle up, scanning corners, clearing rooms, with Ruiz at her back, every step measured, every breath controlled. Because panic here killed people. Because the only thing standing between her and failure was the same discipline that had carried her through every impossible shot she'd ever made. 2 guards near the courtyard center went down fast, and quiet Okafor's suppressed rounds finding them before either man fully registered what was happening. A third bolted for a side door, shouting an alarm that Ruiz silenced before it could carry far enough to matter. Wren's mind narrowed to the same tunnel that always found in moments like this. The world reduced to angles and doorways and the particular math of who moved where and when. She cleared a storage room, empty except for crates of ammunition and supplies that told her more about Nasser's operation than any intelligence report had managed to. Then a hallway. Then a stairwell leading down deeper into the compound's foundation, toward a level that hadn't appeared on any satellite image because satellite imagery couldn't see through solid rock. "Down here," Ruiz whispered, gesturing toward a heavy wooden door at the bottom of the stairs, reinforced with iron bands that spoke of a purpose far more permanent than simple storage. Wren's pulse spiked so hard she felt it in her throat. This was it. Whatever waited behind that door, 27 years of questions were about to end one way or another. Beside her, Okafor's eyes met hers for half a second, something wordless passing between them. A memory of a motor pool and an ammo crate and a sentence neither of them had been ready to finish out loud. "I think it's a person." Okafor breached it with 2 efficient strikes of a small pry bar, iron bands giving way with a groan that echoed down the stairwell behind them. Inside a single room, dirt floor, a cot, a bucket, and in the far corner curled against the wall like a man who'd learned over decades exactly how small he needed to make himself to survive. An old man. Gray hair matted and long, a beard that hadn't seen a razor in longer than Wren could imagine. Thin in a way that spoke of decades of insufficient food, his frame a shadow of whatever it had once been. He flinched at the light, raised one trembling arm to shield his eyes. Wren's rifle lowered without her deciding to lower it, because something in her chest had gone very still the way it went before the most important shot of her life, except this wasn't a shot. This was a face. Older. Weathered by decades of captivity that no photograph could have prepared her for. But underneath the gray hair, underneath the gaunt cheeks and the trembling hands, the same jaw she saw every morning in the mirror. The same eyes she'd spent 27 years searching for in strangers' faces without ever finding them. "Sir?" Her voice cracked on the single word. Can you tell me your name?" The old man's eyes found her face in the dim light, and something in them shifted slowly, painfully, like a door that hadn't opened in decades finally remembering how. "Callahan." He rasped the word, barely a whisper, dragged up from somewhere so deep it seemed to cost him everything to produce it. "Eli Callahan, Master Sergeant, United States Army." He'd said it like a man reciting his own name to keep from forgetting it, like a prisoner who'd repeated those 4 words to himself every single day for decades, the only thing he had left that no captor could take from him. Wren's knees nearly buckled. "Dad." The word came out before she could stop it, raw and unguarded in a way she hadn't allowed herself to be since she was a child. "Dad, it's me. It's Wren." The old man's eyes widened, disbelief and hope colliding across his weathered face in a way that broke something open in Wren's chest that she'd kept sealed for 27 years. "Wren." He said her name like he was testing whether the word still meant what it used to mean. "You were a baby. You were..."
His voice broke entirely. Marion's baby. You can't be.
I am. She knelt beside him, close enough now to see the tears cutting clean tracks through decades of dust on his face. I'm right here. I found you. Behind her, she heard Okafor exhale long and shaking, the sound of a man releasing a breath he'd been holding since a conversation on an ammo crate 3 nights earlier. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Some predictions earned their weight simply by turning out true. He reached for her with a hand that shook from more than just weakness, and she took it, careful of bones that felt too fragile beneath skin gone thin as paper. And for one impossible moment, 27 years collapsed into nothing at all.
I never stopped believing, he whispered. Every single day I told myself somebody would come. I just never let myself believe it would be you.
How? Wren managed, her voice barely holding together. How did you survive it? All this time, how does anyone survive this long? Her father's eyes, sunken but suddenly sharp with something that looked almost like the ghost of a smile, held hers.
Because I had a reason to, he said. Every day I told myself the same thing. Your mother's pregnant with our daughter. She's going to need to know her father didn't just disappear. She's going to need to know he tried. So I counted days, thousands of them. I built a whole life in my head just to survive the one I was actually living. Taught myself languages from guards who thought I couldn't understand them. Memorized every crack in these walls. Anything to keep my mind from breaking even when my body wanted to.
Mom kept a flag, Wren said, tears finally breaking loose, now hot against her dust-streaked face. On the mantel, in a glass case. I used to stare at it for hours, trying to imagine the man who earned it.
Tell me about her, he said, urgency cutting through the frailty in his voice. Tell me everything. We don't have much time, I know that, but tell me something, anything. Decades of not knowing.
She's beautiful, Wren said, the words tumbling out faster than she could organize them. Strong. She raised me alone and never once let me see how hard it was. Not until I was old enough to understand what that kind of strength actually costs a person. She still lives in the house in Abilene. She never remarried. She used to say the desert doesn't give things back, and I believed her for 27 years, right up until about 6 hours ago. Her father's face crumpled, grief and joy tangled together in an expression Wren would carry with her for the rest of her life. She waited, he said, wonder threading through the words.
She actually waited. She never stopped.
There was no time for the reunion the moment deserved. Wren understood that, even as her chest threatened to split open with everything she wasn't allowing herself to feel yet. Because gunfire had already started outside, sharp and close, the sound of the compound's remaining guards, realizing too late exactly what had breached their walls.
We need to move, Ruiz said, appearing in the doorway, rifle up, eyes sweeping the corridor behind him. Now, Callahan.
She helped her father to his feet, his weight shockingly light against her shoulder. A man who'd once carried a full combat load, reduced to something she could nearly lift herself. Okafor took his other side, and together they moved him through the compound's corridors toward the breach point, gunfire chasing them through every turn.
They cleared the compound in 6 minutes that felt like 60, loading her father into the lead vehicle, while the recon element laid down covering fire against a handful of guards who'd finally organized enough resistance to matter.
Contact rear, someone shouted. Multiple technicals inbound from the north, which meant Nassar had more men than the intelligence estimated. Which meant the quiet extraction the operations major had promised was no longer an option. Which meant they were about to run a gauntlet back through terrain that offered almost no cover, with a man too weak to defend himself and a convoy too small to fight its way through, a determined pursuit. The vehicles pulled out fast, dust boiling behind them, the compound shrinking in the mirrors as the first technical trucks crested the ridge in pursuit. Wren sat in the back beside her father, one arm braced around him to keep him steady against the vehicle's violent motion, her other hand white-knuckled on her rifle. "You're safe," she told him, though she wasn't certain yet whether that was true. "You're safe now." He looked at her with eyes that had learned over decades not to trust safety, even when it arrived.
Nassar won't let this go,
he said, his voice steadier now, some of the old soldier surfacing beneath the frailty. He's held me alive for decades because I was worth more to him living than dead. Now that I'm gone, he loses everything he built his leverage on. His hand found hers, gripping with more strength than she expected.
He'll come for all of you, not just me.
Let him come, Wren said, and meant it, every syllable steady despite the fear roaring beneath her ribs. The radio crackled with updates from the recon element covering their withdrawal, terse reports of contact breaking and reestablishing as the pursuit closed the distance behind them. Ruiz drove with both hands locked on the wheel, jaw set, eyes flicking constantly between the road ahead and the mirrors reflecting the trucks gaining ground behind.
How many? Wren called forward. 4 technicals, maybe 15 fighters? Ruiz answered. More than intelligence estimated, a lot more. Which meant this had never been the quiet extraction the operations major had promised, which meant Nassar had prepared for exactly this contingency, kept enough men in reserve to make sure his prisoner's escape came with a price, which meant the desert, once again, was about to demand payment before it let anyone go home. Wren's father gripped her hand tighter as the vehicle bounced hard over broken terrain, his knuckles white, his breathing labored in a way that worried her more than the gunfire chasing them.
"I've got you," she said. "I'm not letting go."
"I know,"
he said, and something in his voice suggested he'd learned over decades exactly how rare a promise like that actually was.
"I believe you."
The convoy reached the mouth of the canyon pass 40 minutes later, the same stretch of terrain where Wren's convoy had been ambushed weeks earlier, the only viable route back toward Widow's Reach, through miles of otherwise impassable terrain. Which was exactly why Nassar's forces had gotten there first. "Contact front," the lead vehicle's gunner called, and the convoy jerked to a halt as small arms fire raked the lead truck's armor. Behind them, the pursuing technicals were closing fast, boxing the convoy into the narrowest part of the pass with nowhere to maneuver. Wren's mind raced through the geometry of the trap, even as her hands moved automatically, getting her father down low, shielding him with her own body without consciously deciding to. Because this was the moment Nassar had been waiting for.
Not to recapture his prisoner.
To make sure nobody who'd taken him ever made it home to tell the story. The full convoy behind them, nearly 100 soldiers, in a larger relief column that had moved up in support once word of the extraction reached battalion, was funneling into the same narrow pass, unaware yet of what waited ahead.
"We need to warn the column," Ruiz shouted over the gunfire. "If they drive into this—"
He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Wren was already moving, scrambling toward the radio in the lead vehicle, screaming coordinates and warnings into a channel already crowded with panicked chatter. Behind her, her father called her name, his voice cracking with a fear that had nothing to do with his own safety.
"Wren, get down!"
She didn't get down. Because somewhere in the chaos, through the dust and the gunfire and the screaming radio traffic, she caught sight of something that stopped her heart cold. A pressure-triggered device, half buried in the roadbed directly in the path of the oncoming relief column, wired to a stack of explosives large enough to level the narrow pass, and everyone caught inside it.
Nassar hadn't just ambushed them. He'd mined the only road home. Her mind raced through everything she knew about the relief column's approach, the timing, the distance, the seconds remaining before 100 soldiers drove blind into a trap built specifically to punish anyone who dared rescue her father. She could hear the column's lead vehicles now, engine strainer against the terrain, close enough that she could see dust rising above the ridgeline marking their approach. There was no time to call it off. No time for anything except the choice already forming in her chest, cold and clear and utterly without hesitation. There was no time to disarm it, no time to reroute 100 soldiers already committed to the pass, already too close, already accelerating toward a kill zone they couldn't see. Wren's mind moved faster than her fear, faster than anything she'd ever felt on the range, every year of training collapsing into a single unbearable clarity. She could reach it. Barely. If she moved now, faster than the part of her brain screaming that this was suicide, she could put herself between the device and the column before the lead vehicle's wheels found the trigger. Because there wasn't time to calculate odds.
because there wasn't time to weigh her own life against 100 strangers she'd never met,
Because some decisions didn't require thinking at all. Only the years of discipline that had already made the decision for her long before this exact moment ever arrived.
"Wren, no." Her father's voice, raw with a terror decades of captivity hadn't managed to erase, chasing her, as she broke from cover and sprinted across open ground toward the buried charge rifle, discarded. Every step exposed to fire from the ridgeline above.
She didn't look back. Couldn't afford to. Every ounce of her focus narrowed down to the small disturbed patch of earth ahead, the telltale wire barely visible beneath a thin layer of dust, the seconds ticking away faster than her legs could close the distance. Because there wasn't a version of this where she let 100 soldiers drive into a kill zone while she stood safely behind cover. Because her father had spent decades believing somebody would come for him, and somewhere in that belief, in that terrible, beautiful faith, was the exact same conviction that was driving her across this open ground right now. That some things were worth more than the life it cost to protect them. Bullets kicked dirt around her boots as she ran fire from the ridgeline, finding her position now that she'd broken from cover, and still she didn't stop, didn't slow, didn't let herself consider anything except the ground ahead and the lead vehicle closing in behind her. Its wheels seconds from finding a trigger that would take 100 lives with it. She reached the device 3 seconds before the lead vehicle of the relief column would have found it. There was no time to defuse it, no time for anything except her own body thrown flat across the buried charge, absorbing whatever the desert was about to unleash, so that 100 strangers in vehicles she couldn't even see yet might never know how close they'd come to dying. Her last conscious thought before the world detonated around her wasn't fear. It was her father's voice, decades old and newly found, calling her name across a compound courtyard as though he'd known somehow exactly what she was about to become. The explosion tore through the world in a single blinding instant, sound and light and pressure collapsing into something too large for her senses to process, and then nothing. She came back to consciousness in fragments. Sound, first distant and muffled like the world was underwater, then light, harsh and white, stabbing through eyelids she wasn't sure she'd chosen to open. Then pain, arriving all at once, everywhere, a wave so total it nearly pulled her back under. Voices, close, urgent. "Significant blood loss. Get a line in now. BP's dropping. I need that unit of O-neg. Stay with us, Sergeant. Stay with me." Somewhere beyond the immediate chaos of the trauma bay, she registered other sounds, the rhythmic beep of a monitor tracking a heartbeat she wasn't certain was strong enough to trust, the particular controlled urgency of medical staff who'd learned to sound calm even when the numbers in front of them suggested otherwise. And underneath all of it, faint but unmistakable, her father's voice, pleading with someone to let him closer, to let him see her, to let him do something other than wait helplessly outside a door he'd only just learned existed. She tried to speak. Her throat felt like it had been scraped raw, every word costing more than she had left to spend. But there was something she needed to say, something that mattered more than the pain screaming through every nerve she had left. "The column?" she managed, barely a whisper. "Did the column?" A face appeared above her, a medic she didn't recognize, young, exhausted, relief flooding his features when he realized she was conscious enough to speak. "They're safe," he said. "Every single one of them. You gave them enough warning to stop before the blast radius. You saved them, Sergeant. All 100 of them." Something in Wren's chest loosened just slightly enough that she could almost breathe around the pain. "One life," she whispered the words, costing her everything she had left to give. "For 100. Worth it." The medic's face crumpled just for a second before he caught himself and went back to work, his hands moving fast and sure over wounds Wren couldn't bring herself to look at. "Don't talk like that's the ending," he said, voice rough. "You're not done yet, Sergeant. Stay with me." She wanted to. She tried. But the world was already fading at the edges, sound and light both dimming into something soft and distant, and the last thing she registered before the darkness finally pulled her under completely was a voice she recognized,
cracked and desperate, somewhere just beyond the reach of her failing senses.
"That's my daughter." Her father's voice, raw with a grief that had already survived one impossible loss and refused to survive another. "That's my little girl. Don't you dare let her go. Do you hear me? Don't you dare!"
The field hospital at Widow's Reach worked through the night in a controlled frenzy that the staff would later describe in reports nobody outside the unit would ever read as the most intense 6 hours of their deployment.
Wren Callahan arrived in critical condition. Massive blood loss, shrapnel wounds across her torso and legs, a collapsed lung that the trauma surgeon fought for 40 minutes to stabilize while nurses cycled through transfusion after transfusion, her blood type rare enough that the base's limited supply ran dangerously low within the first hour. Her father refused to leave the corridor outside the trauma bay, ignoring every offer of his own medical evaluation, ignoring the exhaustion and malnutrition that should have sent him straight to a bed of his own. He sat against the wall watching the door swing open and shut, medical staff moving in and out with expressions he'd learned over decades of reading captors' faces for information they never intended to give, to interpret with brutal accuracy. None of the expressions told him what he needed to know. Ruiz found him there sometime past midnight offering a cup of coffee. The old man accepted with hands that hadn't fully stopped shaking since the explosion. "She's a fighter," Ruiz said, settling into the chair beside him.
"I've served with a lot of soldiers, Mr. Callahan. I've never served with anyone like her." "She gets that from her mother," Eli said quietly. "Not from me. I was just a soldier who followed orders and got left behind for it. Wren's the one who decided orders weren't worth following if they meant abandoning people who needed her."
"Sounds like she gets that from both of you." Eli didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice had gone rougher, closer to the edge of something he'd been holding back since the raid.
"There's a man out there," he said. "Okafor. Younger one, the one who breached my door tonight. He came and sat with me for a few minutes while they were prepping her for surgery."
"Didn't say much. Just told me she'd had a feeling weeks ago that Nasser might be hiding a person instead of a secret.
Said he'd hoped he was wrong for her sake because hoping for a miracle and finding one costs a person something different than just hoping." "That sounds like Okafor," Ruiz said. "He also said," Eli continued, quieter now, "that whatever happens tonight, she already got her answer. That some soldiers spend their whole lives searching for a truth and never find it, and she found hers in a locked room under a mountain, and nothing that happens next can take that away from her." His jaw worked, fighting something back. "I just want the chance to tell her myself. That I heard him. That it matters."
Ruiz didn't answer, just stared at the trauma bay door, willing it to open with news he could survive hearing.
Somewhere in the chaos, standard protocol required a full type and cross-match, a routine genetic screening run against the medical database to confirm compatibility before committing what remained of the base's emergency blood supply. The lab technician running the screen was young, competent, and utterly unprepared for what the system flagged back.
A partial genetic match. Not to a living donor in the database, to a service record. Master Sergeant Eli Callahan, declared missing, presumed killed in action 1992, remains never recovered, buried symbolically at Arlington National Cemetery beneath a headstone marking a grave that had always been empty. The technician stared at the screen for a long moment, certain there had to be an error, some clerical mistake buried decades deep in a database nobody had cross-referenced this way before. He ran the query twice more, hands trembling slightly before he trusted himself to believe what the system kept confirming. Except, the match wasn't a coincidence of common markers. It was a direct familial link, precise enough that there was only one explanation the database could offer: father and daughter. Which meant the man sitting in the waiting area outside the trauma bay, the one who'd refused every offer to be moved to a separate room, the one the staff had assumed was simply a rescued prisoner in need of his own medical attention, was not merely connected to their critical patient. He was her father. A man the United States Army had buried with full honors decades ago. Alive.
Word moved through the base the way word always moves through places where people live too close together to keep secrets for long. By morning, everyone from the mess hall cooks to the battalion commander himself knew some version of the story, each retelling slightly more impossible than the last. A missing soldier found alive after decades. His daughter, a sniper who'd requested transfer to this exact valley without ever explaining why. A rescue mission that had nearly failed at the very last mile, saved only because a young woman threw herself across a hidden bomb to protect 100 strangers she would never fully meet. The battalion commander, a man who'd built his entire career on skepticism toward exactly this kind of story, stood outside the trauma bay reading the DNA confirmation report twice before he trusted himself to believe it.
"Get this to command," he told his aide, voice tight with an emotion he wasn't accustomed to showing in front of subordinates. "All the way up. Today. This isn't just a rescue. This is—" He stopped, searching for words adequate to something that had never quite happened this way before, not in living memory, not in any file he'd ever read. "This is the kind of thing that changes how this whole army thinks about the word missing."
Wren woke 3 days later in a hospital bed at Landstuhl, tubes and monitors surrounding her, in a quiet so different from the chaos of the field hospital that, for a moment, she wasn't certain she'd survived at all. Her father sat in a chair beside the bed. Cleaned up now, haircut, beard, shaved, wearing a set of civilian clothes someone had found for him. Still thin, still fragile in ways decades of captivity had carved into him permanently. But alive. Unmistakably alive, his eyes fixed on her face with an intensity that suggested he hadn't looked away since they'd wheeled her into this room. "Dad." Her voice came out cracked, unfamiliar, weeks of trauma and healing roughening it into something she barely recognized as her own.
"I'm here."
He reached for her hand, careful, like he still wasn't fully convinced this was real and not some cruel extension of decades of hoping. "I've been here the whole time. Wasn't about to leave." "The column, did I—" "You saved them," he said, and something in his voice broke, decades of controlled grief, finally cracking open in front of the one person who could witness it.
"Every single one of them. 100 soldiers walked away because my daughter threw herself in front of a bomb to protect strangers. I don't know where you learned that kind of courage, Wren, but I promise you it wasn't from decades of stories your mother told you about a man who wasn't there."
"It was from the letters," Wren said, her voice steadying slightly.
"And the training manuals, and a folded flag on a mantle that I stared at for 27 years wondering what kind of man deserved that kind of honor."
Her father's eyes filled, and for the first time since she'd found him in that cell, he let himself cry without trying to hide it.
"I don't deserve it," he said. "Not the honor, not the flag. Certainly not a daughter who'd nearly die to bring me home after everything I couldn't do anything to stop."
"You survived believing somebody would come," Wren said. "That's not nothing, Dad. That's its own kind of impossible courage. You just had to trust it long enough for the right person to find you."
A nurse appeared in the doorway, hesitating before she spoke, as though even she understood the weight of interrupting this particular moment.
"Sergeant Callahan, there's someone else who's been waiting to see you," she said gently. "She's been on a flight for 18 hours straight." Wren's heart clenched before she even understood why. Then the door opened wider, and her mother stood there, older than Wren had ever quite let herself picture, but unmistakably, achingly the same woman who'd raised her alone in a house full of unanswered questions. Marion Callahan looked first at her daughter, tears already falling. Then her eyes moved past the hospital bed, past the machines and the tubes, to the man sitting in the chair beside it. Time seemed to stop entirely. "Eli," she whispered the name, barely audible. Decades of grief and disbelief colliding in a single syllable. He rose from the chair on legs that hadn't fully remembered how to hold his weight, and for a moment neither of them moved. Two people separated by decades, standing close enough now to finally close the distance.
"Marion."
His voice broke on her name. "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry it took this long." She crossed the room in 3 steps and put her hands on his face like she needed to confirm through touch that he was real in a way her eyes alone couldn't fully convince her of. "You're here," she said, over and over, like a prayer she'd never fully believed would be answered.
You're actually here.
Wren watched from the bed, tears streaming freely now, 27 years of questions finally, impossibly resolving into a single, unbearable, beautiful moment that no photograph or letter or redacted file had ever managed to prepare her for. They sat together in the quiet after that, father and daughter, 27 years and decades of separate griefs finally converging in a single hospital room, and for the first time in either of their lives, the silence between them didn't feel like absence.
It felt like the beginning of everything the desert had owed them both finally impossibly being paid back in full.
Okafor stopped by that evening, standing awkwardly in the doorway with a small bag of vending machine snacks he'd clearly bought out of nervous habit more than actual thought.
Figured hospital food wouldn't cut it, he said, setting the bag on the tray beside her bed. You were right, Wren said, offering him the closest thing to a smile she could manage through the fatigue. About the compound. About what Nassar was really protecting. I wasn't sure, he admitted. I just didn't want you walking in there without at least considering it. Hope's a dangerous thing to carry into a firefight unprepared. You were still right. He shrugged, but something in his expression suggested the moment mattered more to him than he was willing to show. Sometimes the job's just paying attention to what people are too scared to say out loud. You taught me that, too, actually, back at the range, watching what nobody else bothers to watch. She reached out and squeezed his hand, a small gesture that carried a debt too large for words to fully settle. Thank you, she said, for believing me before there was proof. That's what spotters are for, he said simply. Somebody's got to call the wind before the shot ever gets taken. 6 months later, Wren stood at Arlington National Cemetery on a cold, bright morning, her father beside her in a wheelchair. He was slowly, stubbornly working toward not needing any more, both of them looking down at a headstone that had stood in this ground for over 2 decades. Master Sergeant Eli Callahan, United States Army. Beloved husband and father. A grave that had always been empty, a monument to a man the Army had been wrong about for decades, kept now not as a lie but as a record of everything that had been endured to finally make the truth possible. The story had moved through the country the way certain stories do, slower than a viral headline but deeper, the kind that found its way into living rooms and church groups and veteran halls across every state, retold at kitchen tables by people who'd never met either Callahan but felt somehow like the story belonged to them too. A missing soldier found, a daughter who'd nearly died bringing him home, a family finally made whole after decades of empty chairs at every holiday table. Marion Callahan stood on her husband's other side, her hand in his. Decades of carefully rationed hope, finally, impossibly no longer necessary to ration. She hadn't let go of his hand since the moment she saw him step off the transport plane, and Wren suspected, watching them now, that she never fully would again. They offered to move the marker, Wren said quietly. Since you're not really. Leave it, her father said, his voice steadier now than it had been in the hospital, strengthening daily along with the rest of him. Let it stand. Not because it's true anymore, because it's a record of what it cost to make it not true. Every soldier who walks past this stone should know that story. Not just mine. Yours, too. A small group had gathered a respectful distance away, Ruiz in his dress uniform standing at ease with the particular stillness of a man who understood exactly what this moment meant to the family he'd helped bring back together. Okafor beside him, hands clasped in front of him, watching Wren with the quiet satisfaction of a spotter who'd finally seen his call confirmed downrange. Voss, too, released from active duty pending review, but permitted, at Wren's own request, to stand at the edge of the ceremony and witness the ending of a story he'd carried the weight of for 33 years. He caught her eye once, briefly, and nodded something like gratitude and grief tangled together in the gesture. She nodded back. Not forgiveness, exactly. Something closer to acknowledgement. A debt finally no longer left to fester in silence. Wren knelt and placed a single white flower against the base of the headstone,
the same gesture her mother had performed, alone, year after year for decades of visits that had always felt like grieving into an empty room. This time, the room wasn't empty. This time, the man the stone was meant to honor stood close enough to place his own hand on his daughter's shoulder, close enough that when the wind moved across the cemetery grounds, carrying with it the particular silence of a place built entirely from sacrifice, all three of them felt it together, instead of alone.
1 life for 100, Wren said softly, remembering the words she'd whispered to a medic who wasn't sure she'd survive long enough to explain what she meant. That's what I told them, before I went under.
Was it worth it? Her father asked. Everything it cost you?
Wren looked at him for a long moment, at the life he'd survived decades to keep, at the mother who'd waited without ever fully believing she was allowed to hope, at the sacrifice that had nearly cost her everything and had given instead more than she'd ever imagined possible. Every second of it, she said, because some things are worth more than the life it costs to protect them. You taught me that, Dad, before I even knew your voice. You taught me that in every choice you made decades ago and every day you survived after. Her father reached up and took her hand, the same gesture he'd offered her in that dim cell weeks earlier, except now his grip was steadier, stronger, a man slowly remembering what it felt like to hold on to something instead of merely enduring. I used to think survival was the only thing that mattered, he said. Decades taught me that. Just keep breathing, just keep counting days, but watching what you were willing to give up for people you'd never even met, I think you taught me something I never fully understood, even after everything. Survival was never the point. What you do with it is. Wren pressed her palm against the cold stone of the headstone, feeling the carved letters beneath her fingers, a name that had marked an absence for decades, and now, standing here together, marks something entirely different. We should go, Marion said gently, her voice thick with emotion she'd spent decades learning to hold carefully. It's cold, and your father's been sitting too long. 1 more minute, Eli said, looking out over the endless white rows stretching in every direction. Row after row of names belonging to people who'd given everything and never gotten the chance to stand here and watch their families heal. I just want to remember this, all of it, every single second. The wind moved through Arlington's endless rows of white stone, carrying with it decades of grief finally allowed to rest, and somewhere in that wind, a family stood together at last, whole, in a way that no headstone, empty or otherwise, could ever fully capture. Some debts take decades to collect, but they always come due. And some daughters, it turns out, are simply built to go and get them.